Have you ever felt that the more you understand the world, the less you want to participate in it? It's a strange feeling, almost paradoxical. Those moments when you observe a trivial conversation and realize you can no longer engage with the same enthusiasm as before, or when you flip through the headlines and feel a growing detachment as if you are watching an absurd theater you no longer belong to. It is not about intellectual arrogance or a sense of superiority, but a genuine and often painful withdrawal. Throughout human history, we observe a curious and disturbing pattern. Many individuals who reach deeper levels of consciousness and understanding of the world end up withdrawing from it. Monks in isolated monasteries, philosophers in their ivory towers, artists in reclusive studios, scientists absorbed in their laboratories. What explains this paradox? Why does the deepening of consciousness seem to lead not to greater engagement with the world, but to distancing from it? And more importantly, what does this phenomenon tell us about our current age, in which we see an epidemic of isolation precisely among those who should be guiding our society? Throughout human history, we can observe a recurring pattern. Ancient societies already recognized this tendency. In ancient Greece, philosophers often withdrew from public life after years of study and reflection. Plato, after his frustrated attempts to influence the politics of Syracuse, returned to his academy to teach in a controlled environment away from the masses. In ancient China, many Taoist sages abandoned positions of power to live in remote mountains. Confucius himself, after years trying to reform the political system, spent his last years focused on teaching a small group of disciples, no longer attempting to directly change society. In monastic traditions around the world, from Buddhists to Benedictines, we see the same movement. Withdrawal as a consequence of a clearer vision. What these diverse traditions recognized is that there is something in the deep understanding of the world that can make full participation in it increasingly difficult. But what has changed in our era is the scale and nature of this isolation. We are no longer talking only about a few monks or philosophers. We are witnessing a widespread phenomenon. Ordinary people, after years consuming information and developing a more sophisticated understanding of the world, are withdrawing from public conversations, social media, and sometimes even social circles. They don't necessarily move to caves or monasteries, but they create modern versions of these refuges, closed online communities, houses in remote places, or simply psychological distancing while superficially navigating the necessary social interactions. There are several explanations for this phenomenon. The first and most obvious is what we could call cognitive overload. When you start to see the multiple layers of complexity in every issue, every conversation, every political decision, it becomes exhausting to participate in debates that you perceive to be based on excessive simplifications. Imagine being a climatologist trying to participate in a casual conversation about climate change, where inaccurate statements are launched with total confidence. Or being a historian, listening to people discuss historical events based on memes and decontextualized snippets. At first, you try to correct, explain, nuance, But after hundreds of frustrated attempts, many simply give up and withdraw from these conversations. A second explanation is what we might call a values dissonance. The more you reflect on what truly matters in human existence, the more you may feel alienated from a culture obsessed with status, consumption, and superficial entertainment. It's not that you consider yourself superior, but that your interests genuinely changed. Conversations that once seemed stimulating now feel empty. The goals society celebrates seem increasingly arbitrary. It is like waking up from a dream and realizing that everyone around you is still asleep and insists that you go back to sleep too. This feeling of being awake in a world of sleepwalkers can be deeply lonely. There is also the factor of speed. Our current culture operates at a frenetic pace that favors immediate reactions over careful reflection. Social media, news cycles, cultural trends, everything moves so fast that we barely have time to process one event before 10 others replace it. For a contemplative mind, this pace can be simply incompatible with its natural mode of functioning. It is like asking an artist who paints meticulously to produce a new artwork every hour. Eventually, many of these slower and deeper thinkers simply withdraw from the game, unable or unwilling to adapt to a pace they consider destructive to meaningful thought. What few discuss, however, is the darker aspect of this isolation, cognitive trauma. Seeing too much, understanding too much, can be genuinely traumatic. Think of the teenager who for the first time truly understands the scale of the climate crisis and feels the crushing weight of that reality. Or the young adult who begins to perceive the extent of structural injustice and feels simultaneously overwhelmed by the truth and powerless to change it. There is a specific kind of pain that comes with deep understanding of the world's problems, especially when that understanding is not accompanied by clear paths for meaningful action. In addition, there is what we could call epistemic isolation trauma. It is the experience of seeing something others do not see, understanding something others do not understand, and being unable to convey that understanding. Imagine trying to explain colors to someone who has never seen, or music to someone who has never heard. After multiple frustrated attempts, many simply give up. This isolation in understanding can be as painful as physical isolation, perhaps even more. The problem worsens when we consider the role of technology in our era. Modern technology gives us access to more information than we have ever had, allowing levels of understanding previously reserved for experts. At the same time, paradoxically, that same technology often simplifies, distorts, and accelerates public discourse in ways that make it nearly impossible to communicate complex ideas. The same platforms that allow us to learn about any subject also shape communication in ways that are hostile to nuance, context, and depth. This creates a vicious cycle. The more you learn and understand, the less adequate the tools available to communicate that understanding seem. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this cognitive isolation that we are discussing resonates most with your personal experience? Have you ever felt this sensation of seeing too much, of understanding too much, to the point of feeling that you no longer belong in the conversations around you? I know that many times we keep these experiences to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming arrogant or alienated in a world that celebrates constant connection and uninterrupted participation. But your experience is valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments, I feel this cognitive isolation when. Your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective experiences instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these sensations together, we can begin imagining ways to face them without sacrificing either our expanded consciousness or our human connection. Historically, societies developed mechanisms to deal with this phenomenon of isolation among the most conscious. In many traditional cultures, there were specific social roles for those who saw differently. Shamans, prophets, philosophers, artists. These roles recognized the tendency toward isolation, but also created channels for these individuals to continue contributing to the community. The shaman could live away from the tribe, but returned for important rituals. The prophet could retreat to the desert, but came back to deliver his messages. The philosopher could create his academy outside the city, but his teachings eventually informed civic life. What seems to have changed in our era is that we lost many of these cultural mechanisms. We no longer have clear rituals or social roles that allow both the distancing necessary for deep reflection and the periodic reintegration with the community. Instead, our modern institutions often force a binary choice: fully participate in the accelerated pace and simplifications of mainstream culture, or withdraw completely to the margins. This problem becomes especially acute when we consider what this means for our collective ability to face the complex challenges of our time. If those with the most nuanced and profound understandings of systemic problems are withdrawing from public conversation, who remains to guide our responses to these problems? We have inadvertently created a system that selects against precisely the type of thinking we need most. Take, for example, the issue of artificial intelligence, one of the defining challenges of our era. Many researchers who best understand both the potential and the risks of AI express frustration with the state of public discourse on the subject. On one side, we have simplistic narratives about killer robots and Skynet. On the other, an equally simplistic techno-utopian optimism. The reality, as these researchers know, is much more complex and nuanced. But how to communicate this complexity in a media environment that favors alarmist headlines and sound bites? Many end up speaking only among themselves at academic conferences and closed environments, while public discourse continues to be dominated by voices that oversimplify the subject. A similar pattern can be observed in almost every complex issue of our time. Climate change, economic inequality, political polarization, public health crises. In each case, those with the most sophisticated understandings often feel alienated from public discourse and withdraw to more restricted spheres where they can communicate with others who share their level of understanding. The result is what we can call a consciousness escape from the conversations that matter most. It is as if we are experiencing a collective form of epistemic adverse selection, where public spaces of deliberation gradually lose the most informed and reflective voices, becoming increasingly dominated by those with the greatest confidence and the simplest views. This creates a negative feedback loop. The more public spaces are dominated by simplifications, the more those who see the complexity withdraw, making these spaces even more simplified. There are, of course, notable exceptions. Occasionally, exceptional communicators emerge, capable of translating complexity into accessible forms without sacrificing accuracy. Thinkers who manage to keep one foot in the world of deep reflection and the other in public discourse. But these individuals are rare, and they often face criticism from both sides, accused of excessive simplification by specialists and excessive complexity by the general public. What is at stake in this dynamic is not only the quality of our public discourse, but our very ability to survive and thrive as a civilization. The challenges we face in the 21st century are of unprecedented complexity, intertwining technology, ecology, economy, and culture in ways that defy our understanding. If those who best understand this complexity continue to withdraw from the conversations that shape our collective response, our chances of successfully navigating these challenges decrease drastically. So what would the solution be? How could we create a world where expanded consciousness does not necessarily lead to isolation, where those who see more deeply are not forced to choose between superficial participation or complete withdrawal? Part of the answer may lie in creating new types of spaces and institutions that allow for different modes and rhythms of engagement. Let us imagine public forums that do not follow the logic of virality and immediate reaction, but that allow for the development of ideas over time, platforms that reward nuance and accuracy instead of outrage and simplicity, cultural rituals that allow movement between states of intense engagement and distanced contemplation. Another part of the solution involves developing new communication skills. We need a new generation of translators capable of connecting different levels of understanding, people who can inhabit multiple cognitive worlds and serve as bridges between them. This requires not only rhetorical skill, but also epistemic humility and deep cognitive empathy. Perhaps we also need to reconsider our expectations about what constitutes meaningful participation in our society. The current model often assumes that everyone must be engaged in the same way, at the same pace, in the same spaces. But a healthier social ecology might allow for different types and degrees of participation, recognizing that some forms of contribution may come precisely from temporary distancing and deep reflection. There is also a personal dimension to this issue. For those who experience this cognitive isolation, there is a delicate balance to be found. Withdrawing completely may protect your mental sanity, but it also deprives the world of your unique perspectives. Remaining fully engaged may lead to exhaustion and to the compromise of your intellectual integrity. The challenge is to find selective and strategic forms of engagement that preserve both your mental health and your ability to contribute. It is important to recognize that this is not only an intellectual or social problem, but also a spiritual one in the broadest sense. Many contemplative traditions have long recognized that an expanded view of reality can lead to a sense of alienation from social consensus. These traditions often offer practices and communities that help navigate this territory, balancing solitary insight with compassionate connection. Buddhism, for example, speaks of the figure of the bodhisattva, the one who attains enlightenment but vows to remain engaged in the world to help all beings. Contemplative Christianity explores the balance between the contemplative and the active life. Taoism discusses how to navigate between the world of conventional forms and the understanding of the formless Tao. Perhaps these traditions contain wisdom that can help us navigate the contemporary paradox of consciousness and isolation. When we look at the history of human evolution, we see that our species developed primarily as social beings. Our brains are calibrated for interactions in relatively small groups with direct communication and immediate feedback. The world we have now created, with its vast networks of global communication, its compartmentalized systems of specialized knowledge, its information overload, and its distorted incentives for communication, is radically different from the environment in which our brains evolved. In this sense, perhaps the phenomenon we are discussing is not so much an anomaly as an adaptive response to an informational environment that has become, in certain aspects, toxic to our natural cognition. Isolation can be seen not as a failure, but as a form of cognitive self-preservation in the face of an informational ecosystem that has become hostile to healthy human thinking. If we adopt this perspective, then the question becomes not so much how to fix those who withdraw, but how to transform our informational environment so that it is more conducive to human cognitive flourishing. How to create spaces, technologies, and social norms that support depth and nuance of thought instead of eroding them. This is a question that goes far beyond conventional politics or institutional reform. It is nothing less than redesigning our collective cognitive ecology, and this redesign cannot be imposed from the top down. It will have to emerge organically from new practices, new tools, and new types of communities. We can already see the beginnings of these new cognitive ecologies in various experiments around the world. Communities that are creating alternative modes of conversation, of sharing knowledge, of making collective decisions. Technologies designed to deepen thinking instead of accelerating it. Physical and virtual spaces that facilitate the transition between different modes of attention and engagement. These experiments are still marginal, but they may contain seeds of broader transformations. As more people experience the paradox of expanded consciousness and the resulting isolation, the search for alternatives to the status quo becomes more urgent. And perhaps, ironically, it is precisely those who now feel most isolated and alienated who may lead the way in creating these alternatives. There is something deeply hopeful in this possibility. What now seems to be a personal crisis for many conscious individuals may in fact be the catalyst for a necessary evolution in our collective way of knowing, communicating, and collaborating. The current discomfort may be the precursor of a wiser mode of being human together. But this transformation will not happen automatically. It requires that those who experience the paradox of consciousness and isolation make courageous choices. The choice not to withdraw completely, even when that seems to be the most comfortable option. The choice to experiment with new modes of engagement, even when they initially seem strange or ineffective. The choice to build community with others who share this dilemma, even when it would be easier to remain alone. And it also requires something from those who do not experience this paradox so acutely. It requires the willingness to recognize that perhaps there are perspectives and insights they do not yet see, and the humility to consider that those who seem to be withdrawing may be responding to something real and important. It requires the patience to listen to other modes of communication, other rhythms of thought, which may initially seem incomprehensible or irrelevant. When we talk about the great challenges of our era, we tend to focus on issues such as climate change, pandemics, nuclear war, or super intelligent artificial intelligence. But perhaps underlying all these challenges is an even more fundamental one: how to create forms of collective knowledge and decision-making that can adequately respond to the complexity and scale of the systems we have created. How to prevent our growing ability to see and understand from paradoxically leading to an inability to act together. It is a challenge that touches the very core of what it means to be human in this unique historical moment. We are developing ever more expanded forms of consciousness capable of understanding increasingly vast and complex systems. But our institutions, technologies, and social norms for communication and collaboration are not evolving at the same speed. The result is a growing disjunction between what we can see and what we can do together. Closing this gap is perhaps the meta problem on which our chances of solving all the other great problems we face depend. And paradoxically, those who feel the weight of cognitive isolation most intensely may be the ones with the greatest contributions to make to this vital task. If you recognize this paradox in your own life, if you have felt the weight of expanded understanding and the loneliness that often accompanies it, know that you are not alone. There are others like you trying to find their way through this challenging territory. And perhaps as you find one another and begin to experiment with new forms of connection and communication, you may help forge the paths through which our civilization can advance toward a wiser relationship with knowledge, technology, and one another. This is not a challenge that will be solved in one generation. It is an aspect of the great story of the evolution of human consciousness that has been unfolding for millennia. But each of us who faces this paradox in our own lives is participating in this story, contributing in some small way to the direction it will take. The question we began with was why the most conscious beings are isolating themselves from the world. Perhaps the answer is not that they are isolating themselves from the world as such, but withdrawing from a particular mode of engagement with the world